Mr. Little here. And on this History Bite, we're going to take a look at Chapter 23, Part 1, Change and Continuity in Ideas Across Europe. By the end of this History Bite, you'll be able to answer the two following questions. How did changes in technology lead to the spreading and distribution of ideas across Europe? And how did the scientific revolution represent both a change and a continuity in human history? These questions and much more. This is going to be a slightly longer one than normal, so please strap in and hang on. So there are a bevy of new ideas that we're going to talk about, but let's just contextualize a little bit about why this time period saw such a broad eruption of new ideas. So first things first, voyages of exploration. In addition to finding a new continent, Europeans discovered a new continent that no one had known existed previously. So think about it like this. The ancient sources that Europeans would have had access to, the Greeks, Muslims, as well as the Bible and other ancient texts, none of them had any notion that there was a whole separate continent on the other half of the world. This was a mind explosion, right? And part of the explosion of this mind meant that the ideas could spread further because Gutenberg's printing press made it possible to spread word about the new world faster than before. You may recall from chapter 14 that printing had actually existed in Korea 150 years before Gutenberg, but it had a bigger impact in Europe because Gutenberg's press was easier to use and more people could read in Europe, and it was less tightly controlled than it was in Korea at the time. There was also population growth, and more people means more potential ideas, as well as a rise in urbanization. So all of these factors kind of came together and resulted in all these new ideas popping up. So let's talk about them. They come in three major groups. The very first one is the Reformation. Now, the Reformation broadly refers to the splintering of Western Christianity into the Catholic Church and to the Protestant Church. Now, Protestant sounds like protest, and that is one of the roots of the word is to protest the practices of the Catholic Church. Now, the Reformation was not the first time that European Christianity had been split. The Great Schism split the Eastern and Western churches in 1054, and then a number of reformers had also challenged the authority of the church. Now, the Reformation is largely credited to Martin Luther, who was a Christian monk, who was a very faithful individual, and he opposed church practices he saw as not necessary for the achievement of personal salvation. In particular, he didn't like the sale of indulgences. This is the paying of money to relieve you of sins or to relieve your now deceased relatives of sins. He wrote 95 Reasons Why This Is Wrong, aka the 95 Theses, and these ideas sparked what is called the Protestant Reformation. These ideas were so radical that a lot of people said, yeah, you know, there is a lot wrong with the church. And so Martin Luther's ideas, there were a lot of them, but you could easily define them down to two categories. And in their Latin words, they are sola scriptura and sola fide. Sola scriptura means through scripture alone, aka through just the Bible. And sola fide means through faith alone, as in just your faith in God. You don't need the church. You don't need indulgences. You don't need good works. And this is what really divides Protestants and Catholics. Another Protestant reformer named John Calvin, he put forward not a new idea, but he popularized an idea of predestination within his church. And while I don't want to get into the theology of it, predestination is also an attack on the church. Because it presupposes that you do not need all these church institutions like priests and bishops and saints and good works and feast days. You do not need all of this in order to be saved or achieve salvation. Now, while this was a principally religious dispute, various groups did take up the cause of Protestantism for their own means. Peasants really liked the idea of equality before God, which is what Luther had been preaching. And they took this in a literal sense, and they revolted against many of their masters. Luther didn't agree. He told the princes they should crush the German peasants. Some of those princes also adopted Protestantism, but a little less probably from personal conviction than from the desire to confiscate church lands, which they could do once they declared themselves Protestant. And so while it was a principally religious dispute, it did take on a more secular, it had secular consequences. That is, it had non-religious consequences. Just like the empire strikes back, the church would also strike back with the Counter-Reformation. And this was the Catholic Church attempting to counter the arguments of the Protestant Church. And one of the ways they did this was the Council of Trent, in which the church came together and said, you know what, some of these critiques were correct. We do need to clean up some of the corrupt practices of some of our priests. However, they did not embrace the Protestant theology, and they continued to insist that you did need a priest, and you do need the saints, and you do need all of these things that Martin Luther had said you don't need. So they kind of doubled down and reinforced the idea of Catholic order. They also founded a group called the Jesuits, or the Friend of Jesus Society, whose job was to retain Catholics by educating them, as well as to debate Protestants. And Jesuits were very well-trained academic individuals. And so you kind of have the battle lines drawn now. You've got the Catholic Church on one side with the Catholic monarch supporting them, and you have the Protestants on the other side with the mostly Protestant monarchs supporting them. The Reformation had other consequences as well. So, for example, the witch hunts. We think about the Salem witch hunts in the United States, which were a very particular episode, but there were also witch hunts across Europe. Mostly older women who lived alone and maybe practiced older forms of medicine were accused of being witches during this time when everybody was terrified that the Catholics were going to come murder them in their sleep, or the Protestants were going to come murder them in their sleep. So this kind of hysteria led to the witch hunts that we think about as kind of a social consequence of the Reformation. And as I said before, Gutenberg's printing press allowed Luther's ideas to spread further than they might have without that press. So here's kind of a map of after the 30 Years' War, which we'll talk about later. This is kind of where the major denominations were of Europe. The yellow, the blue, and the orange are all Protestant denominations of some sort. And the darker green is Catholic, and the lighter shades over here are Eastern Orthodox. So this is sort of, this is where, European Christianity fragmented. But the Protestant Reformation was not the only major shift in ideas going on during the time. We also see the beginning of something almost at the same time called the Scientific Revolution. Why is it a revolution? Let's find out. So we need to clarify quickly, when we talk about science, we're not talking about technology. This is kind of a confusing point because we like to use these words interchangeably. Throughout history, most inventions, most technology was not done scientifically. It was created by tinkerers. It was gradual, small steps, little changes, but it wasn't a systemic system of testing and improvement. Technology was just sort of gradual. Science, as we know it, the system of observing, drawing conclusions, and making statements about the world, would not be perfected, if we can call it that. The scientific method would not be perfected until the 1920s. But scientific revolution is the beginning of that way of looking at the world. And it really does sort of begin with Nicholas Copernicus in the European context, who argues, after observing planetary motion, he argues that, in fact, the sun does not rotate around the Earth. It's the other way around. The Earth rotates around the sun. Now, the ancient Greeks had argued that, in fact, the sun rotates around the Earth. This is called the geocentric universe. And the church had towed this line as well. But Copernicus said, no, it's the heliocentric universe. The sun revolves around, the Earth revolves around the sun. The sun is the center of the universe. And it is also worth noting that he came to this conclusion, and it is widely believed that he borrowed the works of several Islamic scholars that he at some point must have been exposed to. It is not known how or when or through which book, but Ibn al-Shatir and Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, who were Islamic mathematicians, seem to have done formulas that Copernicus appears to have copied at some point or been exposed to at some point. Copernicus's work would be followed up by Galileo, who witnessed a celestial event, I believe it was a supernova, and said, aha, this is proof that the planets are in motion, right? This is proof that the universe changes and can change, which again contradicted the Greeks, who said, no, the universe is perfect, it doesn't change, it doesn't move. And so Galileo and some of his successors were very much about this idea that we should now experiment and observe, draw conclusions about the world around us. Roger Bacon is particularly famous. He's sometimes called the father of modern science because he said that we should build a framework and we should examine nature. He kind of compared nature to like a prisoner, if you will. He said we need to not view nature as a very nice, pleasurable thing. We need to put nature in a torture device and make nature tell us their secrets. The world was to be examined and experimented, not just enjoyed or viewed and appreciated. Right, and this view was sort of built upon by Isaac Newton, who developed whose work led to a system of framework for the world, right, which we call Newtonian mechanics. Right, Isaac Newton was the one who theorized gravity, among other things, but his work led to a framework for looking at the world. We call that Newtonian mechanics, which was the accepted paradigm until the discovery of quantum mechanics in the 1930s, and the kind of shifting paradigm at the time. So it's worth noting a few things. One is that the scientific revolution was built on precedents. So it was built on precedents from the ancient world, such as the atomist movement, which viewed the world as measurable and material. It had precedent from the Islamic Golden Age, where thinkers did run experiments, and they communicated with one another, and they discussed and debated. Probably the famous exchange between Ibn Sina and al-Biruni is a good example of this, as well as the Renaissance, which predated the scientific revolution, and its emphasis on physical mechanical technology. All of these things helped lead to the scientific revolution. So it didn't come out of nowhere, but it might still be going on. There is a question of whether the scientific revolution ever actually ended. And, because we still live in a scientific world. We live in a world where we observe and we collect data and we measure things. And so there's the case to be made the scientific revolution never actually ended, and that we're still living in a scientific age. But on a more down-to-earth point, some prime consequences of the scientific revolution would be much bigger guns. Galileo, for example, was hired by several different rulers to build better cannons that could shoot over castle walls because he knew how physics worked. And therefore he could build bigger guns. That was one kind of direct consequence of the scientific revolution. There was also the creation of royal societies that would sponsor research. The most famous one is the Royal Society of London, which is still around today and still publishes and still funds scientific research. And so this is the first time we actually saw government, a regular government support for a scientific society. Now, individual rulers may have patronized artists, as we've seen like throughout history in the Renaissance, in the Islamic world, in China, but never had a government, so to speak, budgeted for scientific research. That was a new thing. As well as with the world being a measurable thing and science being able to understand the world better, this led in a broad sense to the increased exploitation of ecological resources, which is a fancy way of saying when we could build better mines, we could dig deeper and exploit more resources. When we could build better logging machines, we cut down more trees. So the world was exploited in a way that it had not previously been exploited, and we're still dealing with the consequences of that today. So something to keep in mind. So the last thing I want to talk about is something called the Enlightenment. And the easiest way to think about the Enlightenment would be to apply the ideas of the scientific revolution, that is, measuring data, making observations, drawing conclusions, take that and apply it to political life. This is the easiest way to think about it. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but go with me here. If you take a logical question of who should run society, a lot of these scientific thinkers, these Enlightenment thinkers, did not think, oh, some guy whose great-grandfather was king 1,000 years ago should be running us still because he's got like royal blood in him. A lot of people, when they thought about that, they said, it doesn't seem quite right. And so one of the things that the Enlightenment is well known for is questioning the divine right of kings. There were a lot of other outgrowths of the Enlightenment, like the idea of natural rights, which comes from a guy named John Locke, who believed all humans were a blank slate. And I should note that most psychologists and sociologists would not agree with that conclusion today. But at the time, the idea that all humans were blank slates, we were born blank, meant that we all had natural rights, and we were able to exercise those rights. And government should protect those rights. This seemed like a rational thing to John Locke. And life, liberty, and property, which was his famous phrase, would be carried over in the American Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, with a slight modification. There was also the development of the idea that society should be governed as an agreement. That would be the social contract theory. Thomas Hobbes is famous for saying that life sucks, and therefore you need a king to keep life from being too terrible. And in his case, he took a very negative view. But a lot of political theories have since then adopted a stance that they are in agreement between the ruler and the people, not in which the ruler imposes themselves upon the people, but that the ruler somehow governs from the legitimacy of the people. Almost every state today, with a few exceptions, always claims to have some sort of mandate from the masses or from the people. If in theory, if not actually in practice. And you also have the idea that knowledge should be available widely and to everyone. Denis Diderot came up with an idea called the Encyclopedia, in which volumes of books would contain articles on all the world's knowledge. And we can see this idea has continued to this day in Wikipedia, which is available to everybody. And although it's not perfect, it does strive to have all the knowledge of the world in one place. So how did the Enlightenment begin? Well, it's an outgrowth of the scientific revolution, as I said. A lot of really smart, well-educated, very wealthy individuals would meet in what are places called salons. which were the kind of dining rooms of very wealthy women who would then throw lavish feasts in which these thinkers would get together and they would discuss philosophy, they would discuss science, they would discuss their ideas, and then they would write letters to one another and they would publish each other's books. And the printing press helped make all of this possible. Some kings even action. They called themselves enlightened monarchs. It's important to note that the Enlightenment has its roots in the scientific revolution, but also in wealthy women who supported it, and chocolate and coffee, which come from outside of Europe, but were being imported in large amounts. And the result was that the Enlightenment did represent a fundamental shift in the way a lot of people viewed society. It wouldn't come into full practice until the Revolution and subsequent revolutions. But it really did shift the way the Western world looked at social organization. It was a major shift. Although we should be careful to not overly glamorize it. There were some downsides or shadows, if you will, to the Enlightenment. One of the big shadows would be that almost all these men were from Europe. And so they didn't take a very high view of non-Europeans. Specifically like Montesquieu, for example, who advocated for like limited government and division of power, famously said that like people from the tropical climates could not govern themselves. They were just too lazy from the heat. Therefore, someone else has to govern them. Kind of an apologist for imperial. John Locke's idea about right to property is predicated on using the property, and using the property is different depending on who you ask. And so Europeans, specifically Englishmen who came to the English colonies, often looked at Native American farming practices and said, that doesn't look like using the land. I think we can take this. And so, John Locke's ideas was used often to expropriate Native American land. Enlightened monarchs often waged more wars than their non-enlightened peers, so that kind of is unfortunate. And bottom line is, not all of these guys thought democracy was a good thing. In fact, almost all of them believed in some form of limited participation. Limited government, yes, but not like public participation, like not everybody getting the right to vote. That's crazy. And women, you can forget about it for the most part. And so these people, even though now we associate the Enlightenment with democracy, that is a very recent development. And in the beginning, most Enlightenment thinkers, while they wanted to limit the power of an absolute king, did not necessarily want to give the power to the people. And it's really important to keep that in mind. So, alrighty. Well, I hope that you can answer those first two questions from the beginning of this lecture. You should be able to. I want to thank you for joining me. My name is Mr. Little, and I will see you next time.